Everyone, I'd like to talk to you guys all today a little bit about education in America, specifically how our education system here compares with others around the world. I'd also like to talk to you a little bit about the rise of ADHD in America and the importance of unstructured play and learning time in a child's development. By the end of my speech, I hope to provide you with a little more information about what your options may be and what we can do in order to improve our situation here. Now, I'm going to start by telling you guys a quick story about this really awesome kid that I had the privilege of working with just a few years ago. His name is Keith. Now, the program that I worked for at this time was essentially a field trip program. Schools would bring students to us. We would take them into the woods where they would get to explore, get dirty, find frogs and salamanders, and basically just learn about nature in nature. Now, when the schools arrived, their teachers would divide the students into groups of 12. They would be randomly assigned to a staff member who would become their field group leader, and they would be the one to take them into the woods and explore and guide them for the rest of the 5 days that they were going to be there. Now, the reason that I remember Keith so vividly is that instead of being randomly assigned before the group arrived, my boss sat us all down and asked all of us if any of us would be willing to take a student with severe ADHD. Now, normally ADHD isn't a big issue. However, this particular student was sort of on thin ice with the school. His behavior was bad enough that he had to spend his school days in a room alone instead of in a classroom with his other students. He learned all his information and all of his schooling and just from a one-on-one aid. Now, he almost did not get permission to come along on the trip because of this, and when they decided that he could come along, the one stipulation was that instead of just being in the group with just me as a leader, or just one of us as a leader, he must be accompanied at all times by not only a parent, but also an aide from the school who happens to be the school psychologist. Now, I love working with special needs students, so I volunteered. And as soon as the school arrived, I immediately could tell which student was Keith. He was a little pudgy kid with spiky blonde hair, and he could not sit still or stand still or focus his visual attention on anything or anyone for longer than a few seconds at a time. However, once we got into the woods, it became very clear that he was right at home. He was incredibly intelligent, remembered everything I said almost verbatim, and is a classic example of a child who, just because they're not looking at you, doesn't mean they're not listening. To me, it actually seemed as though all the visual stimulation in the woods was actually really good for him. He could look at things and would still be listening at the same time, and the fact that I would talk for short amounts of times, and then we would spend a lot of time exploring, was really, really good for him. In this method, the kids got to explore what they were interested in and ask questions when they wanted to know something. Now, in this program, because of this, the kids get to learn by what they're interested in. Now, again, in this setting, we're clearly meant to be outdoors and exploring nature. However, unstructured play can happen anywhere. In fact, playtime at school or anywhere with young children builds social skills. It builds a sense of community and awareness of the world around them. In addition to this, when young children are allowed this playtime, it allows them to be able to take risks. Now, risks, while supervised at a young age, help children build confidence, learn natural boundaries. Children who are not allowed to take risks or get hurt sometimes as children, because when they're young, children are supposed to get hurt. It happens. Not badly hurt, but children are meant to get hurt. Children who are not allowed to take risks or get hurt, when they develop and become adults, they either are one end of two extremes. They either are afraid of everything, they never take risks, or the opposite end of that extreme, they feel invincible and end up taking lots of very unsafe risks. In fact, in a study done of urban children, it was found that these children, when taken into uneven ground like a wooded area or a field or even anywhere that had tree roots or rocks, they had difficulty walking and tripped a lot because they had never experienced walking on a surface that wasn't completely flat. Now, Many people think it is the lack of nature and playtime that is partially to blame for this rise in ADHD that we're having in America right now. In fact, in his book, Last Child in the Woods, Richard Louv explores this topic and coins the phrase nature deficit disorder in order to describe this generation of children who don't know how to play outside or don't know how to have fun without the bonus of electronics or things having the fun for them. Now, ADHD, like I said before, is on the rise. In addition to Louv's theory about a lack of nature, some people also believe that electronics are to blame, that children are bombarded with sounds and images from everywhere, and that change so quickly that the real world just can't live up to it. Now, whatever the reason is, the change and increase in ADHD is undeniable. I'd like you to view this first slide number 1, and it shows just the progression from the year 2000 all the way up until the year 2013. Now, starting in 2003, over the course of the 10 years, ADHD has risen drastically. In the U.S., we have one of the highest ADHD rates in the world. Over the course of those 10 years, you can see that the rates have risen from 6.5%, or about 1 in every 13 children, to 11%, or only 1 out of every 9 children. So this is a 42% increase in only 10 years. The total number of children in America who have ADHD right now is 6.4 million. In the US, we have one of the highest ADHD rates in the world. So I want to talk about that a little bit, how we compare to the rest of the world, or at least how our education system compares. Now, in a minute, I'm going to point out a slide right here where you can see that this little green bar is the United States. And this graph is all about different countries in America, the top 25 countries in America for education, in fact. And this is showing the graduation rates of those top 25 countries. The U.S. is all the way down here at 22. In fact, out of those 22, our graduation rate is at 78%. Means 1 out of every 5 children in America right now will not graduate from high school. National average is 83. So not only is one out of every 5 children in America not going to graduate from high school, we're also 5% below the world average. Now, I'm not talking about this to bring you down, but to talk about what we can do to make a change. And in order to talk about that, I'm going to bring up another country who only about 30 years ago was right where we are today. And that country is Finland. 30 years ago, like I said, they were one of the lower scoring countries. And now, for the past several years, they've consistently ranked within the top 5. Finland has become a big topic lately because it was featured a few years ago on a documentary about education in America called Waiting for Superman, and it's for a good reason that they were featured. You see, compared with our 78% in America, Finland boasts a 97% high school graduation rate. So, what makes them different? What is it about Finland that allows them to be so successful? Well, first I'm going to talk about the schools themselves. See, schools in Finland are designated places of learning. Sure, there's lots of playtime, especially for the younger kids. They incorporate many breaks throughout the day, but unlike here in the United States, they have no extracurricular activities at school, meaning that there's no sports, no clubs, there's nothing. So when they're at school, it's all about school. Next, I want to talk about their teachers. Teachers in Finland are highly respected. A master's degree is required of all their teachers, and only the best and the brightest in this country become teachers. In the United States, most of our teachers come from the bottom third. And because of this, a teacher's decision in Finland is respected instead of being scrutinized. Thirdly, I want to talk a little bit about the students and where the difference is there. In the U.S., children start receiving a formal education around the age of 4 or 5. In Finland, children do go to school at this age, but they don't start learning hardcore academics like learning to read or write until they're really ready, which is around age 7. The reason that they do this is so that at a younger age, they really get the time to develop social and problem-solving skills. In Finland, children also receive very little formal testing. In the US, children are given so many standardized tests that in school, they don't have time to actually learn. All they have time for is to learn how to pass the test, meaning instead of really learning, they're just memorizing what they need to know to pass. In Finland, rather than getting these standardized tests, children are evaluated by their teachers. In fact, the teachers have time to do so because here, especially in urban settings, where there can be as many as 25 or 30, even 35 students in a class, Finland averages only 14 students per teacher. Which brings me to my next point, which is that here, because there's so many students per class, students in America are put on a very rigid timeline. In fact, kindergarten starts around age 5, you graduate at 18, maybe 17 if you have a summer birthday, and that's that. The problem is that not all kids learn at the same speed. One kid may not be ready to go to second grade when another kid is, and then a few years later, it might change. Now, one kid may be great at math and terrible at spelling, whereas another child might be great at spelling but have trouble with those math formulas. Because of in America, the No Child Left Behind Act, children are being passed whether they're ready or not. This law was intended for all children to be able to get the help they needed, but instead, because of heavy curriculum requirements and too many students being assigned to each teacher, many teachers just don't have the time. So students either fall through the cracks or are passed so that a teacher doesn't have to deal with them again. Even in situations where a child isn't ready and should be held back, and a teacher is really deciding this for them, in many schools, it's not the teacher who gets to decide. The decision is ultimately up to the parents. In Finland, they view moving forward a little differently. Instead of thinking our way, where at the end of every year you move on to the next grade no matter what, and if you get held back, it's something that you're doing wrong, they instead view moving ahead and passing on as a privilege. Instead of going in whole semesters or whole years, children are evaluated at the end of every 6-week unit. At the end of that 6 weeks, if they're ready to move on and pass on, they do. If not, they stay in the unit that they're in. And it's very normal for students to do this. So that way, instead of getting to the end of a year and realizing that they're not going to be quite ready, they repeat 6 weeks instead of an entire school year. Now, Finland clearly has come a long way. And here in America, we can too. Remember, 30 years ago, they were in the same place that we are. The thing that they realize is that change takes time. In the US, we have activists, we have government workers trying to make a change, but in the meantime, there are options. In addition to public schools, there are sorts of private schools, as well as charter schools, Montessori schools, essential schools, and Waldorf, which is just to name a few options. And these can provide that same type of education that all children in Finland are receiving. Now, there are also things that we can do. If you have children, you could consider trying one of these other schools, but whether you do or don't, the biggest thing and easiest thing that anyone can do, aside from just becoming an activist, is vote against budget cuts for education and legislation that will put more regulations on teachers and schools. Now, I know that I've just bombarded you with a lot of information, and not all of it is very positive, but I'm going to leave you on a positive note. Remember before, a few minutes ago, when I started out talking about that little boy, Keith? Well, I only worked with him for 5 days. By the last day, he was thriving, doing so well that his teachers actually decided that he could continue on our last field group without any extra supervision, without his aide, and without his parents if they didn't want to go along. And he did very well. In such an open setting, it was perfect learning environment for him. I even a few weeks later received a letter from his school psychologist that he was doing so well socializing with his classmates that they were starting to slowly incorporate him back into regular classes instead of learning in a room alone by himself. Now, if this much of a difference can be made in only 5 days for one student, imagine what could happen if this was a system that we incorporated into all schools. Even just a little bit of a change can make a huge difference. Thank you.